Our next speaker is from Aon. Aon has always been a fantastic supporter of the Analytics Institute, and this year is no exception. Over the years, no major international organisation has ever organised for their global chief operating officer to address our little gathering. So it's just a reflection of just how important data analytics is to Aon that we are joined this morning by James Platt, who's Global Chief Operating Officer of Aon, to discuss the driving growth through digital. So please welcome James on stage.
Thank you, Lachlan, and thank you to the Analytics Institute for inviting me to talk to you and address you today. We live in a world which is becoming ever more risky. Cyber risk is increasing immeasurably. Last year, $20 billion got paid in ransomware by different organizations, health organizations, companies, governments. That's 57 times more than it was 5 years ago. Climate risk, and look, you've heard presentations today already talking about the climate. Climate risk is a huge challenge to many companies, many countries across the world. Last year, $258 billion of losses driven by climate. And you've all seen the impact of the pandemic on supply chains. If you look at our supply chains, 30% of organizations have had their supply chains seriously disrupted. 20% are having sourcing issues today. Risk is everywhere and increasing. Aon really is about how can we take data, analytics, digital technology and help clients protect themselves. But there's an issue. There's an issue that every organization faces, which is getting that protection. This slide shows you the protection gap. The protection gap is the difference, in this case, of catastrophic losses, that $258 billion, and how much is protected. And today, 61% is unprotected. People have to find the cost. It doesn't get paid for by insurers or other organizations. That's a huge issue, particularly in the developing world. Every year, we go and ask organizations across the world about their risks. And we sort of say, well, what risks have you got? What are your most major risks? What can you insure today? What can you protect yourselves? And which ones can't you insure? What this page shows you are the top 60 risks that those organizations come back. And when you look at it, you see only the blue ones are properly insurable, protectable. Organizations need to protect themselves if they're going to make investments, if they're going to actually be able to be confident about the future. Yet look at this picture. Sorry, the picture's on the left. Look at the gaps. Our industry, the industry that Aon is in, the risk industry, has a real challenge. Up until the 80s, insurance covered an increasing amount of GDP and peaked in about, I think, 86, 87, by covering about 3% of GDP. And look, I knew this was a very technical audience, and I knew that you would like a picture. Normally, I'd have taken off the regressions, but I thought that this audience would appreciate the R squared. It's went up, and then since 86, 87, it's been in decline. So the relevance of what we do is dropping, and it's been dropping for many years. Given the importance of insurance, that's a real problem. So let's think about another industry, and let's look at where we can maybe take some inspiration. And I thought I'd pick what is one of the oldest professions, although you may think that differently, farming. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I remember reading, and at the time I'd been really interested at Monsanto, sort of seed chemical company, had just purchased Climate Corporation. I thought this was strange. They paid about $1 billion, which, to be honest, at today's valuations feels pretty good, but at the time felt like a huge amount to pay for what was really a startup collecting different climate data together. Now, Climate Corporation, though, had this amazing amount of data around really fields, climate. They could look at a 10 by 10 square, and this was 7 or 8 years ago, in 30 million US fields, and talk about the soil conditions, talk about the likely climate. So Monsanto bought this data. What they then did with the data is they bought another asset, which was really clever seed drill technology or planting technology. And they brought together the data from Climate Corporation and the clever technology, and they were able to provide better knowledge than farmers traditionally had in their own heads. And trying to have better knowledge than farmers is pretty difficult, given they've had many, many years of looking after the same fields. When you brought these things together, you brought the data, the seed drill technology, you drove yields by 13%. 13% better yields and actually 20% lower input costs, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, in the previous, I think, 50 years, through the whole recent agricultural revolution, yields have gone up less than 13%. This technology, applying data to the problem, worked for farming. If you take the industry we're in, it's the same. The key to us closing that protection gap, the key to us reversing the trend, the key to us being able to protect organizations is data. But there's a problem. In fact, there's a couple of problems. The first one is the insurance industry is very traditional. It uses not just data, but it uses history. It wants to go back. First time I ever worked in insurance, I had this brilliant analysis, and I showed it to one of the underwriters, and they said, well, that's useless. It's only 5 years data. We don't work on anything less than 25 years. So we have an industry that wants history. Why? Because it needs confidence. So this history is important. So just having data is not enough. But if you go to cyber, you go to climate, you look at the pandemic impacts, none of them have a history. So the first challenge is, how do we do that? And we really do it two ways. We need a huge amount of data, new data, and we need models and analytics that we can be confident in. And not only we can be confident in, but the people that provide capital, the money behind protection, can be confident. That takes a massive amount of analytics and a massive amount of thinking to deal with these new emerging risks. There's another problem, and I'm always wary in most audiences of putting any chart on the page which really has sort of databases and arrows and boxes. But this is important, and this is something that isn't really necessarily talked about a lot. We're all getting very excited about the shift from the old world of data, which I grew up in, to the new world of data. But some of the differences are not obvious, but they're really important to us. In the old world, if you were a marketing director, you had a problem like, how can I sell more, whatever it might be? And you've had a problem, you built a database to support that problem, you connected other data stores into it, and you're able to really address that issue very clearly. And because you were the business sponsor, you owned the problem. And you really wanted to make this work. It was tricky to do. It was complicated in the old world. If you come to the new world, we have this amazing ability to bring data together onto platforms and pretty much ask it any question. But in an organization like ours, the problem is, who's asking the question? What questions are they asking? And who owns the answer? These are the real issues that you face when you're trying to do analytics in new industries. And frankly, nobody believes the models either. So we've moved from a world where we had too little flexibility to a world where all the flexibility creates real business issues that we have to deal with. So that's the problems for us. How do we develop confidence? And how do we be clear on the problems we're trying to solve? And I've got 3 examples that I wanted to sort of talk through a little bit that illustrate some of these. And I have sort of 3 thoughts around what's important. The first one really reflects that second problem, which is understanding needs. Needs and being accurate about them is critical if we're to solve any problems. And so often we find it's not clear. People aren't able to describe what they're really trying to do. One of the areas that we've spent a lot of time focusing on in recent years is intellectual property. And here's a need that a lot of our clients have that they, frankly, didn't even know they had, and still are somewhat unsure. If you go back to the 1980s and you look at the S&P 500, or for that matter, any large index globally, the assets that those organizations have are tangible. They're property assets, pretty much. They're physical things that you can insure and protect. If you go forward and you look forward and you come to today, 75% of the assets of those companies are intangible assets. Their IP, their brand, they're things that are not tangible and are really hard to protect. There's very little data about it. So again, if you go back to my relevance chart earlier and you think about the analytics, you think about what we have to do, how do we address that? Well, the starting point is explaining how can you protect the intangible assets. IP, critically important for the world, hardly protected at all. So how do we go about it? How do we even think about something like that? Well, what we started to do was build a database. Went out around the globe and started collecting all IP information, 100 million patents. But collecting patents together isn't very valuable. How do you actually understand them? Then you can apply modeling to start to say, hey, what's comparable, what's not comparable, which ones are worth a lot, which ones aren't worth a lot. How do you think about that? Well, you apply the latest analytical thinking. And at the end of it, you've got a tool which allows any organization not just to value its IP, but to start to use it in new ways, to start to use it as collateral for investment, and start to be able to say, well, who's infringing on it in different ways? So suddenly we have a way of protecting intangible assets. And nobody even knew this was a need 5 years ago. So if one is understanding needs, the second is really building trust. One of the most critical things that we all have to do if we're going to use data, if we're going to take advantage of it, is we have to build trust with those that provide it to us. And again, that sounds obvious now in a world of social media and GDPR, but still organizations get this wrong and don't spend long enough explaining why we need data. For us, one of the big challenges is what we call the underserved. There are many groups out there which do not have the protection they need, not just large organizations, but individuals like all of us. Health plans, our own personal insurance. To get to those underserved, we need to think of new ways of doing a few things. Educating, what protection do you need? Matching, what's the best product for you? And distributing, how do we get it to you efficiently? Those are the challenges that we have, and they're the challenges that data and analytics, again, can help us solve. One example, we provide health plans to large organizations, but there's millions, if not billions, of choices in those health plans. How do we match the needs of individual to get to the best possible outcome versus the cost of providing the plan? Because every organization has limits. Trying to do that across billions of choices required us to, first of all, build a conjoint analysis around what people value, and then build a cost analysis and estimate tool. We have a product called Architect that brings these together and allows organizations to make the best possible choices for all of their employees around health plans. What used to take us about 12 weeks of manual effort now can be done instantaneously. What that means is organizations provide better health plans at lower cost that are more valuable to their individuals. So this using data and analytics to get to the underserved is incredibly important. Lastly, we all work in ecosystems, and actually the world you all work in is probably the most important ecosystem of all. None of us can solve the big problems I raised at the beginning individually. We can only solve them together. Climate challenges, let's say $258 billion of losses just last year, which by the way is increasing. That's 26% higher than the average this century alone. This is a number that's only going to go up. So how can we actually deal with this? So what we need to do is we need to find capital, cash, that is willing to protect, that can be drawn on when there's a disaster. So there's a couple of challenges. First is, how do you model it? And climate modeling, particularly new climate modeling, is extremely complex. So we work with a lot of organizations like Columbia in the US who've done a huge amount of cutting-edge climate modeling that we can start to bring in. That's one problem. The other problem for insurance and protection is, when do you pay out? How do you know what losses? You can't wait until the losses have all come in, because then the money doesn't get to the right place. So we've spent a lot of time building products around what we call parametric triggers. Parametric triggers are very simple. If a storm happens that is so bad, as measured in this way, it gets paid no matter what. That means you can get the money to the place you need it quickly. And then the last point is working in ecosystems. So to try and deal with global risk in this area, so I'm talking now country level risk, we've been able to create what we call catastrophe bonds by working with the World Bank, some leading insurance companies, banks, to start to model the real risk on different countries. So in a lot of the LATAM areas, so Peru, Chile, they now are able to go out into the market using and obtain insurance for these catastrophe bonds. These catastrophe bonds are modeled on the likely climate outcomes, and then they work on parametric triggers and provide real billions of dollars to these organizations. So maybe in summary, as we think about trying to protect the globe, as we think about protecting organizations, the only way our industry can become relevant and grow is through data and analytics and digital approaches. There's no other way. We've been losing relevance for many years. What we're beginning to see now is a new relevance through applying them, which to me is hugely exciting for the future and actually critically important for the world. Lachlan.
Thank you, James. Really appreciate it. Excellent presentation. Just before we let you go, you have emphasized trust in data, and it's something that's going to be brought up a few times today by various organizations. So you're working at senior level with a lot of major organizations. What strategies are they putting in place to ensure the trust in their data?
I mean, Lachlan, it's a great question, and obviously, requires quite a lot of discussion. I think for us, transparency. I mean, there's a set of capturing data and using it. Clearly, there are a lot of black box models out there which can be pretty effective, but are not transparent. Clearly, just telling organizations you're going to use their data in a particular way is one thing. Transparency is really the key for us, and actually letting organizations come in and understand what we're doing, how we're using the data, and why that's important. And I think the more we do that, and at senior levels, so that they really do understand, I think you build trust. With individuals, again, when we've seen it, right? I mean, in some ways, regulators have now enforced it, but I think this transparency will just continue to increase.
Yeah, it's still about a human relationship at some level, isn't it?
Yeah,
That you get the same things.
You've got to
apply.
trust me, right? We've got to build personal trust.
Yeah, and it concerns me because even when we ask now people to share their data with us for this event, more and more are reluctant to do so, and it's just it's just happening out there. So it's really important that our organisations fully understand that. Yeah.
It's,
James, listen, thank you very much. I know you're an extremely busy man and you've a very important job, and to take the time out today to be with us, we're very grateful to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lachlan. Thank you.